Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out to the Pesko Lunchtime Lecture Series. I would first like to thank Miami-Dade College for letting us use the space here today. I'd also like to thank Peggy, especially for standing out in the parking lot and making sure we all got our good parking spaces right. Thank you. I would also like to thank Miami-Dade Cultural Affairs, of course, because without them and the grants, we would not be able to make these presentations possible. I'm going to pass it over to Peggy to introduce Magdalena. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'll stand to the side of the podium here. We have Maggie's presentation. She prefers to be able to share the slides with you. So we're not ignoring you. Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Miami-Dade College. We're happy to have you again. It's our second time this year, and it's a thrill for us to have you come out and share this beautiful space, these wonderful facilities, and the information that comes through these events. Maggie's going to be speaking to us about the Roadway to Freedom, something that very few people know about. And she's got a very illustrative. Did I say that? No, she's illustrative. But she has a wonderful presentation with PowerPoint for us, and I'd like to present her. She's a retired professor for us. She is one of the favorites of the students. They admire her knowledge and her energy that she brings to all the work that she did for us here on the campus. So I would like to introduce Magdalena Lamarre Burton.
Shelf. Okay. Watch me kick that. Okay, hello and welcome. Again, it's not that I don't want to look at you, but if I look at you, I can't look at the screen, and I want to make sure that I match the screen in terms of the information. There is some information on the screen, but I also explain and add more information. There are pictures. It's a history class that I basically taught here in American history, and I also taught sociology. So what you're going to be getting is kind of a social history of Florida. As Peggy said, I taught here. I just retired, so this is kind of like a return, and I feel like a little bit out of it. I was actually nervous. It's been a year, so coming back here is always great. Coming back here to share information is even better, right? It's really neat. In any case, as you can see, today's presentation is called the Roadway to Freedom, and it's about Florida's Underground Railroad. I'm sure some of you probably have some information about this. You may know about it. In any case, there's a lot of other stuff that I threw in here just in case to make it a little bit more informative. And in case you do know about this, I wanted to make sure that everybody walked away, that everybody walked away today with at least one new piece of information. So if I can do that, then that's great, right? In any case, hello and welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you today aspects of American history that for some of you may be a new information. We're all familiar with the Underground Railroad used by runaway slaves from the South who sought freedom across the Mason-Dixon line, excuse me, frequently guided by courageous conductors of the Underground Railroad, the most well-known being Harriet Tubman. Few, however, are aware of the first Underground Railroad used by runaway slaves to find freedom. Actually, many of the first slaves in what is now the United States fled to their freedom by running south, not north. And that's what we're going to talk about today. If you recall your American history, the first permanent settlement or colony established by the British in what was later become the United States was in Jamestown in 1607, located in what is then known as the Virginia Land Grant. Well, let me move this. Okay. It doesn't matter if you can't read the stuff on the map, just look at the arrows, because that's what I really want you to see. Now, at its greatest extent, the grant included the modern states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. So we call it the Virginia Land Grant, but it really was pretty much the whole southern United States. The English king, Charles II, granted the land to 8 lords proprietors in return for their financial and political assistance in restoring him to the throne in 1660. Charles II was restored after Cromwell left power, the Roundheads. His father was Charles I, who lost his head. And when he was restored, this period is called the Restoration. Now, he did it as a thank you for all of the support they had given, but he had another purpose. His purpose was also to serve or establish a buffer zone between the Carolinas, Georgia didn't exist yet, and Spanish Florida. The Spanish actually claimed all of the land from Florida to Newfoundland, all on the coast, and west to Mexico. So you can see that you now have two competing European countries here. So when we look at this area, what actually is going to be established is a buffer zone, an area where there was a lot of fighting, but also an area that was kind of open, a pathway, a roadway. And that's why it became the roadway to freedom for many escaped slaves. Now, the Spanish, as you remember, okay, they had arrived in the United States in 1513 when Ponce de Leon led the expedition to the coast of Florida. During this time, Spain had established exclusive domain control. The British, of course, didn't agree. Now, this is going to be a period of constant rivalry, first between Spain and the British, and later between the English and the Spanish, and then the United States and the Spanish, and the United States and the British. Throughout this conflict, we're always going to have the people we know as the Seminoles and the people we know as the Black Seminoles. And you're going to be seeing a lot of names that are used for them. Can't see this thing. Now, when we read stories of the early explorers, we do not hear about a lot of individuals that were part of history. We only hear, and at least I did in my textbooks, and I'm sure we had the same textbooks. You're going to get today, you're going to be introduced to aspects of American history that for the most part have been left out in the history books. Unfortunately, Black Indians, like other African Americans, have been treated as invisible. Although they have been presented from the beginning, have been present from the beginning in the history of what we today call the United States and the Americas. So what I'm going to start with is actually explorers, because some of these explorers were also runaway slaves. However, some of these explorers were free Black men. Okay, so not all of the Africans who came to the Americas were slaves. In the first period, we're going to have individuals that were slaves, but were explorers and sailors and soldiers that were part of the early expeditions to the Americas. Now, this map shows you the movement south, because not only did they go there it is. Not only did they come from this region here, you see there Savannah and Charleston, south into Florida, but they also went south. They went into the Bahamas, they went into the Caribbean, and you're going to see they went into Mexico. So today's history is going to cover all of these movements. Okay, let's go to the Black explorers. Not all of the persons of African ancestry entering the United States, the New World, in the 16th century were enslaved people. Free Africans took part in the military expeditions. One of the first people that are discussed, that are identified, was part of Columbus's exploration team. And as you can see, he had Black crew members. His pilot was Black. And one of the ships was owned by the pilot's brother, also Black. In this case, freemen. Okay, they were not slaves. In April 15, 1513, right, recently coming, Juan Ponce de Leon took possession of Florida. On his team, he had two individuals, Juan Garrido and Juan Gonzalez. Both were also free men. They would be the first documented persons. Now, they may not have been the first, but they're the documented, because the Spanish have the records, right, of ancestry, African ancestry, to set foot in the continental United States. This is Juan Garrido. He was part of Cortez's expedition. So you see him here with the conquistador, in this case, Diego Duran. You see him here, right? He's on the side. You can see the African features, carrying a weapon, in this case, a spear. Oops, not yet. Now, Juan Garrido was an individual who played a very important part during this exploration, all right? He was a free man, and he's considered the first documented Black person to arrive in the Americas He's the first black conquistador. He participated in the expeditions in Cuba and Puerto Rico, so he was among the first expeditions into those Caribbean islands, so part of the claiming of those islands. He was also part of the exploration to Florida, and he participated with Hernando Cortés in the conquest of the Aztecs. The next individual here is Pedro Alonso Niño. Now, he was Columbus's pilot, known as El Negro, the black. He was born in Palos, Moguel, Spain, to black African Moors. So he was born a free man. He was not a slave. He was a navigator of Columbus's ship, and he was an explorer because they, you know, when they were part of the crew, but they would go and they would explore. He navigated Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, and his brother was the the navigator or captain of the Niña, which was his own ship. So this was a family business. Again, they were free. They were businessmen. They owned property. Now, he accompanied Columbus on his second voyage, and his brother was master of the Niña, and he was among the first free persons of African ancestry to come to the United States. So you have here individuals that were not enslaved. The next person, all right, we're going to meet is Estebanico Lamarre. In this case, we do have a black person who was a slave, who comes to the Americas, but he was an explorer. You see him here, okay, dressed in the conquistador outfit. You see the dogs. The dogs were used by the Spanish to terrorize the natives. They were very large, they were hunting dogs, they were trained to attack and kill. And the natives in the Americas had never seen this kind of an animal. So when they saw them, this was like, you know, run. And they did use them to take down captives. And again, kill them, not necessarily capture them. They used them like hunting dogs. And of course, their prey were the natives. Estebanico is shown here, and these are busts that are kind of recreations. We don't really have accurate records. But he did spend a lot of time with the tribes in the South United States. He actually traveled from Florida. He came through the Caribbean, through Florida, all the way to Mexico. And he encountered some of the tribes there in the Southwest. So you see him with the feather. You see his having been incorporated into some of these tribes. Now, in 1527, he was a slave. He was part of the second expedition set up to conquer Florida. They claimed Florida in 1513, but did not really actively do any claiming. He was one of the 4 survivors, of only 4, he was 4, of an expedition of 300 men that came to Florida. At one point, they're captured by the Indians. They escaped. They traveled throughout the United States. He would act almost like a medicine man or like a spiritual voodoo priest. He knew about herbs and plants, so he would cure with the Indians. He was enslaved. Him and the 3 Spaniards with him were enslaved, but he survived. Eventually, they reached Mexico, and in the meantime, they traveled the Southwest, right, the whole Southwest, from Florida to Mexico. So here we have a person who really carried on an extensive exploration of the United States in its early beginnings. He is the first documented person of African ancestry, born in Africa, right, to enter and explore the southwestern part of the United States. So that's a distinction, free versus slave. Now, we have another individual here that you may know him, especially if you saw the Lewis and Clark expedition documentary that came out on their anniversary. But most of the time, he's not mentioned in the books. And even in this beautiful monument here, you don't see him because he's in the back with the dog, all right? You know who this is, right? Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark. And who do we have behind? We have York, who was Clark's slave and traveled with him throughout the entire expedition. There is a couple of these markers, and this one is dedicated to him. It gives you information about him, that he was born in the Carolinas. He was a slave. He grew up with Clark, but he was a slave. I mean, he was his slave. And some of the things that have been discussed about him is that he was part of the expedition, but because he was a slave, he didn't receive any of the money or any of the rewards of the exploration. He didn't even really get any kind of recognition until present times because he was a slave. Again, that invisible person. But it seems that when he came back with Lewis and Clark, after these years of exploration and freedom, being part of the team, carrying a gun, an African carrying a gun, right? Hunting, contact with the Indians, making this trip, right, with them, he experienced a certain kind of freedom, and it seems that he wasn't very happy with his condition when he returned. There are mixed stories that Clark eventually set him free. There are other stories that he ran away. If he ran away, then he will be one of the individuals that we're going to be talking about today that were called Maroons, or runaway slaves. As part of the anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition, they have done a lot of statues throughout the United States. This particular one, I think, is in Kentucky, and it shows him. Again, we don't really have a accurate depiction of him because they describe him, but there were no pictures or any drawings. But you see him here, and again, you see him with a rifle, which was unheard of in the then United States. For a slave to carry a gun, it was actually illegal within the continental United States, part of the slave code. African who was caught with a gun could be killed. And the master would have to pay a fine, okay, who gave him the gun. So this young man is York, and again, how many about you knew about York? Remember York from the expedition? Again, that invisible history, right, the invisible people. And as we go into this, we're going to be looking at a word that I mentioned. I call them the Moors. The Maroons. And the Maroons are the escaped slaves. And we're going to be basically focusing on these people because that's really what we're going to be talking about here. We're talking about these individuals who dedicated their life and their time to fighting and looking for freedom. It was always freedom. And these people that we're going to look at, most of them sought that freedom by being escaped slaves. We're going to now look at the Florida Maroons, since I introduced them, and we're going to look at some of the names they're known by. You're going to see this list is kind of long. They're all the same people, in a way, okay? So let's go through them quickly. Eventually, they're going to be called the Seminole Negroes because they lived with the Seminoles. And some of them were actually half Indian and half black, but some of them were not. They were just called Seminole Negroes because they did belong to the Seminoles. They were kind of slaves, but they weren't. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And they were also called the Indian Negroes, meaning Negroes belonging to the Indians. They were also called the, and this is what the white people call them, white Americans. The Native Americans called them the Estelusti. So these were the allies. Because one of the things that we're going to see develop very quickly from the beginning is this alliance between the Native Americans, who themselves were enslaved. And as we know, there were a lot of wars and they were sold into slavery, land was taken, and these individuals, because they shared a common goal, to be free and to run away and to survive. So we're going to see a long history of these individuals. Now, they're called the Seminole Blacks because they live with the Seminole natives even today, Indians, in different parts of the United States, including Florida, okay, the Florida tribe here. They're also called the Seminole Freedmen because, the most part, they were free. And even we see when they go to the Oklahoma Territory during the Trail of Tears, they will go as free men. Unfortunately, their freedom was not guaranteed. But they were, on paper, freed men. They're called Afro, through history, you see the changes? They were called Afro-Seminoles because they were black and they were Seminoles. Negro Indians, because some of them were Indians and Negro, black. There was a lot of intermarriage there. Black Indians, especially in some areas. For example, in the Bahamas and Andros Island, which again we'll see later, they're called Black Indians because this is one of the places that they fled to in the 1820s. They're called the Black Muscagules, Gulges, or Mascogos in Mexico because some of them had to run away to Mexico in order to escape being enslaved. And today, for the most part, they're called Black Seminoles in general. Again, they're all the same people to some degree. Now, there was, to some degree, intermarriage between the Indians and the slaves, but not necessarily. And one of the things that's very distinct about the Seminole relationship with their Black Seminoles is that they lived in separate communities. They were tied together in a type of slavery that was more like an indenture. They used to pay a tribute, but they were not bought and sold, and their children were born free. Now, there were very few women, very few African women, even those that escaped, very few women were able to escape. They used to keep the women mostly in the houses. They were house slaves, so it would be harder for the women to leave. And of course, the women were used for breeding, so they were carefully watched. The men would be working in the fields, in some cases on their own, So they would be the ones that will most likely escape, although we do have some women that escape. So when these Africans, escaped slaves, Africans, go into the Native American communities, very often they became part of those communities, and some of them took Indian wives. Now, why? The Native American system at that time was matrilineal. So the line of descent, the origin of descent, who was going to be the chief, who your children belong to, and who was going to be like the next chief came from the women, right? Yay, women, right? And if a black man had a child with an Indian woman, his child would be part of the Indian clan. So that child would be automatically free and be Indian, not black. Very often you don't have the Indian men marrying black women. It did happen, but they weren't very often their first wife because there was a problem with their children. Because the line of descent comes from the women, any children they had, even though they were a member of the clan or the tribe, any children they had with black women would not be part of the tribe. And therefore, because slavery, especially by 1697 in Virginia, the slave laws change, and slavery is assigned to the woman, to the black woman and her children, right? Then their children would be slaves, regardless of how they look. That's kind of linked to the one-drop rule that we still have today, that you can have, you can be biracial, and in some cases, regardless of how you look, you are black, because you have one drop of black blood. So for the Indian men, it was not safe for their children to be born outside the tribe. And even though there were some marriages, it was not as common. Some of these Indian Africans were actually owned by the women. That's how they kind of took control of them, and they did marry them. They had ceremonies. And in some of these tribes, the women also had more than one husband. So they would have an Indian, a native husband, and they would have the African. How times have changed, right? Now, these individuals still exist today, all right, as a people. And it kind of tells you where they went here quickly. I'll go into why they went here, but you can see that this group today, right, in Texas, they call themselves Seminoles, because they live in Texas now. But they emphasize that they are not Indians. These were black freedmen, Africans that did not mix. There might have been some mixture or some that were Indian, but for the most part, they were not. They were Africans that married and stayed within the same race. Those that went to Mexico, okay, Coahuila, Mexico, they're called the Indios Mascagos. They still live there. And some of them crossed the border into Texas after the Civil War, and they then call themselves in Texas, right? They call themselves black freedmen. In Oklahoma, because they went to Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, with the Native Americans, when the 5 civilized tribes were forced to leave Georgia, right, Florida, the East Coast, in the Trail of Tears, when they were forced to leave, some of them chose to go with the Seminoles because they were family members, they were members of the clan, they had children, and they were kind of like an indentured servant. Some of them chose not to, just like some of the Seminoles chose not to, and that's why we're going to get into the Seminole Wars. And the reasons that they chose not to was because leaving Florida created a big problem, a danger for them. They would be crossing through slave territories, and they would be the target of slave raiders. Even in Florida, they were constantly under watch and were constantly being captured and sold into slavery. Even when there were treaties that protected them, supposedly, these treaties were not honored. So some of them did go to Oklahoma, and they still live with them in Oklahoma territory. And of course, the Seminoles who live here, some of them are part of the community. And some of them went to the Bahamas, and they're called the Black Indians there. Okay, so we're going to look now what are the Seminole Maroons. Now, what is a Maroon? Specifically, when we talk about Maroons, it's a Spanish word, cimarrón, and what it basically means, it was used to refer to cattle that had escaped and had become wild. But the idea was the escape. So when we talk about Maroons, whenever Africans came into the Americas as slaves and they escaped into rebel communities, they would now form these communities, which even today are called Maroon communities. They still exist throughout the world. And the Spanish call them cimarrones or runaways. Eventually, the British called it Maroons. And this term came to be used for all enslaved individuals or free who escaped into these communities, because the constant thing was fleeing into these communities. Who was the first Maroon? Well, we don't know if he was the first Maroon, but he was documented, and that what makes this guy important. A scholar, Carlos Guillot, states, according to the Spanish archives, because the Spanish have an extensive archives for their whole period of exploration. I know because I had to read them as part of my graduate work when I was doing my master's. And, oh my God, their hello and goodbye alone would take 2 pages. Hello, every single title they held. Goodbye, every single title the person held. So you have these very extensive records, and evidently, okay, immediately upon arriving on the island of Hispaniola, Governor Nicolas de Ovando complained that the slave had escaped. So he says to the king, don't send any African slaves, because look what they're doing. They're escaping, and they fled amongst the Indians and taught them bad customs and never could be captured. In the Caribbean, this was very easy to do, because the Caribbean, if you know, are all mountain ranges. So you have a lot of these communities all spread out through the Caribbean in these mountain communities, and they still exist today. It's not going to be so easy in Florida, because we don't have mountains. Georgia, maybe. What helped them in Florida were the Everglades and the swamps, all right? And the fact that a lot of the land that they ended up on was land that nobody wanted, because it was swampy, and you really couldn't farm on it or raise cattle. So you have here the first Maroon. Now, what's going to happen now is going to have Maroon communities established, because this becomes a pattern. So we hear the first day that this slave arrives in Hispaniola, gets off the ship and runs away. And whenever they could, this became the pattern, right? So when we look at the early communities, one of the first communities that has a large documented population that escaped was in present-day South Carolina. We hear about the first colony established, Jamestown, and then we hear about Plymouth, and we hear about the Carolinas, et cetera. But really, okay, you can see that in 1526, the Spanish explorer Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, he led an expedition to South Carolina and established a colony. Didn't survive, so it was a failed colony, but almost 100 years before, the Spanish were trying to establish that claim. Now with him, he had 500 Spanish men and women, 100 slaves, so these are probably the first enslaved population in the Americas. He had 3 Dominican missionaries, because the Spanish, one of the things about the Spanish slaves, they were converted to Catholicism. And to some degree, that gave them a little bit of protection by the church. Once they were baptized, there were certain things they had to be given. That's not to say that slavery was nice or benign in the Spanish Americas, but it was a little better than, say, the kind of slavery that we're going to see in some parts of the North and in other islands of the Caribbean. Under the British, the Portuguese, no, the Portuguese also converted them. Under the British, the French, and the Dutch. Now, it was a disaster. They were not prepared. They had trouble with the Indians, who became immediate allies of the natives, of the Africans. The reason they became allies was in a previous expedition, Ovando had sent an explorer to kind of like take the lay of the land, and he captured some of the Indians that he encountered and sold them. So they were very leery of dealing with Ovando, so they were not on friendly terms at all. Ayllón dies, and there goes the expedition. He gave it over to his, the charter that he got from the king, he gave it to his nephew, but his nephew was in Hispaniola, so that didn't do any good. So the survivors, 150 of them out of 500, 150 of them returned to Hispaniola. The slaves rebelled and fled. So they established, and we don't know what happened to them, a Maroon community right there, okay, in this area of South Carolina. This is before the British established South Carolina. Another famous one, didn't know about him, did you? In Mexico, was Gaspar Yanga. He was the African leader of a Maroon colony of fugitive slaves in Mexico in 1570. Okay? He established it in the highlands of Veracruz, Mexico. To this day, that town exists and it's named after him. Now, Yanga, all right, escapes into these mountains, and he basically has a successful community. This community will last, even though the Spanish make repeated attempts to capture them, this community will survive to the point that he's able to negotiate a treaty with them and gain their freedom as a free community in the 1600s. In 1871, he was designated a national hero by the Mexican government as being really the first liberator of Mexico. This is right after the Mexican War of Independence. So Yanga, which is a town today, and the people of this region still live in Mexico. And when we look at these individuals, we see the mix. We see these are what we would call black Mexicans. These are not the Mascagos. These are black Mexicans, descendants of these Maroons from the 1600s. So this is one of the oldest Maroon communities in the Americas. And you can see here the African ancestry, but also some of the Native American, right? In both cases, the dress, but in her case, you can see the eyes. So there's a mixture because, again, they did marry. They did do families, establish families. Now, who were the first black Floridians? Well, again, going back to St. Augustine in 1565, we finally have the colony established. And we have that it included slave and free Africans as the first settlers. They actually formed 12% of the population. That's a pretty big number in those days. 1 out of every 5 was free. So even though you had the slaves present, you had this large free population, community there. In 1683, the first free African militia was formed. Once again, they're militia, they're soldiers, they're Spanish soldiers. They carry guns. You can imagine by now, Georgia and the South Carolinas, they were outraged. Because here this community of free black men and slaves lived pretty much independent, and they were the border patrol and the border protection. You know, they protected the Florida, that region of Florida where St. Augustine is, which is the border with Georgia. They protected it from the British. So see, we don't need a wall. We just need people willing to do their job and patrol, right? Now, freedom in Spanish Florida. They don't know how it happened. Somehow news traveled in those days. Who knows, right? We're talking about 400 miles in some cases. But somehow the slaves in South Carolina and in Georgia learned that if you went to Florida, you were free. And in 1687, the first documented group of black slaves from Charlestown, which was what Charleston was called then, which included 8 men, again, 2 women, and a nursing child, managed to escape to St. Augustine. Okay, this is a trek. We're talking about a trek of at least 300 to 400 miles on foot, running from slave catchers, running through the swamps, hiding in the forest, and probably made it because of assistance from the Native Americans, because I think it's the Native Americans who bring them to St. Augustine. When they came to the fort, of course, what do you think the Georgians said, or the South Carolina, the British? Give us back our slaves. It took them a year to get, and what did the Spanish say? No. No, they are now part of our community. Why? Because there was a royal decree. In 1693, Carlos II, the King of Spain, he granted freedom to all British slaves who fled to the Spanish territories. Again, he had a purpose in this. And Florida became an official sanctuary at that point, because now there's a document encouraging the runaway slaves. And what did this document say? This is the Spanish part, which is harder to read. This is a translation. I don't expect you to read it, but I want you to look at the highlighted parts, and you'll notice something, right? The king says, he acknowledges that 8 males, 2 black females had run away from the city of San Jorge, St. George. He also says that they arrived to that presidio. Presidio was fort. In California, they have the presidios. They use that name for the U.S. forts now. That's what the Spanish call their forts. And pretty much all of the colonies established, all of the settlements established by the Spanish had forts. That's why you have in Puerto Rico the 2 forts, Cristobal and El Moro. You have it in Cuba. You have it in Santo Domingo. You go into you have it in Cartagena de las Indias. In all these areas you go, you have these forts. St. Augustine, and of course, all of the cities up and down the coast of California, they were all forts. And this was a way for them to claim that territory. It always included the soldiers, a priest, and Native Indians that lived there. And in some cases also Africans, because we don't even cover that today, but there's a whole group of black Africans, black Indians that were part of the Cheyenne, Navajo, Apache tribes in the West too. Now, notice what they asked for. They asked for the holy water of baptism. Because by becoming Catholic, they were now under the protection of the church. And while they may still be slaves, some of them, they were still under the protection of the Catholic Church. And this is going to be an important distinction. And in this case, even though you see that the sergeant, right, tried to claim them, the sergeant in the town tried to claim them, he said no. Because they had adopted the Catholic doctrine and become Catholic, they then were to be set free. Not all of the ones that arrived later were immediately set free. Sometimes the Spanish governors didn't honor it, but they were pretty independent. And if they served in the militia for 4 years, those that served would become free. Eventually, there will be a doctrine that will be passed again, and all of them will be free. And that's going to be what creates the town of St. Moise, up above St. Augustine, Florida. Okay, let me go to the next one. So we're going to look now at the establishment of the fort. One of the leaders, the established leader of the runaways was this particular slave who was Mandingo, and he eventually takes the name of one of his masters. He actually escaped. It took him like 3 or 4 years to get to, Florida, and he comes to St. Augustine. Within a very little bit of time, he becomes a commander in the fort, but he was still a slave at this point because they didn't always honor the freedom immediately. He arrives with other slaves who had fled, and for 2 years he was in command of the militia. And we're going to see how they dress. They didn't dress with cast-offs. They weren't dressed like paupers. They were part of the Spanish militia. Some of them were officers with their uniforms, their proud uniforms, and their medals, and their sabers, and their guns. So they were really, even if they were slaves as part of this militia, they were an integral part of this community. In 1738, the black militia was granted unconditional freedom when they actually stopped a British invasion. And they petitioned for the Spanish crown to give them a town, and eventually they do. And this town is what we call today Fort Mose, because it was a fort that was there. The purpose was to protect St. Augustine. So this was actually before you cross from Georgia to Florida, you first reach Fort Mose, and then you were in St. Augustine. The Spanish colonial governor established the fortified town of Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Moise, or Fort Mose. It was a Maroon community, in this case, legally sanctioned by the Spanish crown. So it was not just a community, it was a community on papers. This is probably the first legally established black community in the Americas. By 1738, immediately, right, again, how did they know? How did this news get to them, right? Talk about this movement of individuals. Over 100 runaways arrived at the fort. The founding population grows again when 23 more black men come with children. They had come from Port Royal. So we're talking about distances, right? Running away from slave traders. And again, they formed the first free black settlement legally sanctioned in what would become the United States. Here are some pictures. Okay, these are actually prints of how they dress. And you can see they were in full uniform. They're nice soldiers. They're proud. They're standing. They're not like, cast-offs. Here on the other side, what we see is present day, the fort is a national historical site. Every February, they recreate. They're reestablishing the fort. They're draining the swamp area. They're building it. But there's a currently museum there. It's one of those landmarks. And they dress up and they recreate battles and the community that's there. So if you go to St. Augustine or just go there, it's really nice. And they're looking for people to participate in their growth because they're trying to reestablish the community. Right now, they're trying to build the wall, the outside wall of the fortress. The wall, it was a fortified town because the fort was their town. It had a moat and they had cactus in it. And they lived there with their families. So it was a fort, but it was also their home. And you can see them that they dress up, all right? And they had families. You see the children are part of the recreation and women. If you go online and you put Port Mose, you can see the whole website. You can see actual recreations of their battles. You can see different individuals. And there's a character, Fernando Menendez, who talks. He's in character. He's a historian. He works there. And in character, he talks about the whole community. So, it's a recreation, but it's good to see the different things they're doing there in terms of education today. Now, one of the most famous battles is going to be the Battle at Fort Mose, and this occurred in 1740, and this was Georgia's Governor Oglethorpe Georgia was established as a military base by the British. Again, they needed that buffer. So since Fort Mose and St. Augustine was the Spanish side, Georgia was the British side. When Oglethorpe requested the grant in Georgia, which was part of the Carolinas, he wanted it to be for retired soldiers who couldn't live on their pensions in England, and also for debtors. It didn't allow slaves, didn't allow women, didn't allow alcohol. Needless to say, it was not a fun place, so it was not too successful. But one of the things that he did try to do, he was one of the first people who made an attempt to invade Florida and gain a fort, capture it for the British. He goes into the fort, they capture the fort. Menendez has to go to St. Augustine, but they go back and they actually successfully remove the troops. The fort is destroyed, but needless to say, they repel the British. They force them to go back to the Georgia side. So the fort and the militia serve their purpose. The fort will be rebuilt later, and they'll return to it. And eventually what happens is they have to leave the fort again. Now, again, this is the Fort Mose State Park, right, the whole land grant. You can see them here dressed in character. You see all of the different groups, including, here they have, I guess what you would say, the Native Americans, right? I guess the Spanish, the Africans. And you see them here recreating a battle. And in this case, it's only blacks, because the black militia was separate from the Spanish. They were not under the command of the Spanish military. They were a separate, independent military unit with their own commanders. Now, what is Fort Mose? Well, Fort Mose, and this route that I've described, this route from the Carolinas all the way down into Georgia and then into Florida and through Florida and eventually into the Bahamas and into Mexico, this will be what we consider the first Underground Railroad. Because the purpose of the Underground Railroad was a road or a path, a way for the escaped slaves to gain freedom. And there were different areas where they were helped by escaped slaves and by Indians. So this is what today, by the Freedom Underground organization, has designated different sites, and Fort Mose is one of the first ones. Okay, so it's one of the original sites of the Southern Route. And it is a National Historic Site. Oops, sorry, what did I do? Oh, wrong part. Now, it's not the only one though. We have another one that was just designated in Key Biscayne. It's the second official underground site. From Key Biscayne, specifically Cape Florida, in the 1820s, the black Seminoles will leave Florida. These are Seminoles that decided not to stay in Florida because by now Florida belongs to the United States, so now slavery is introduced, and also decided not to go with the Seminoles that were relocated to Oklahoma. So they decide that they're going to leave Florida, and they will go to Key Biscayne off Cape Florida. They will pay the skippers there to take them to St. Andros Island. They will go on Indian dugout canoes, and they fled to the St. Andros Island as a separate community. They still live there. They have their own community, their own language, their own history, and they're called the Black Indians. Recently, if you want, I have a list of readings. There's some archaeological work that has been done looking at that community itself. It still exists. A lot of these Maroon communities still exist as independent communities. Even though they were part of the society, they're also separate. So what is Key Biscayne? It's considered the second underground site. I'm sorry I couldn't get a better picture. That's like the best picture of the marker in Key Biscayne. I'm going to have to go take my own picture. You see that in 2004, Cape Florida was designated part of the National Underground Railroad. They're now in the process of taking Red Bay's Andros, which is the Black Indian community in the Bahamas, and also Nacimiento, Mexico, where they fled in Mexico. They're getting them to be recognized as international sites on the Network Freedom Trail. So again, you see it's going south and also west. Okay, so what happened to them? Now that they're here, what happened to them? I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I guess you want to know about what happened to these individuals, where they went? Okay, well, like I said, they're still alive today. They're called Black Seminoles. Actually, you can see here that they're kind of dressed, an African man, but dressed as a Seminole. And again, you see the musket. This just horrified the Spanish, I mean the British. African Seminole relations were always together because they shared common goals and they shared common enemy. The Maroons, the free blacks and runaways were in regular contact, especially in Florida. In 1882, the census estimated that there were 800 blacks living with the Seminoles. This is living with them. This doesn't include the ones that had separate communities. One characteristic of all of their settlements was that they were highly militarized, and they had their own independent communities. Even when they were called slaves of the Seminoles, they still lived separately and paid them tribute. They paid them like a portion of their crops. They actually had a land system, kind of like feudalism, right, where you have the land. One land was Native American Seminole. One chunk of land was theirs for their own, and in the middle was the one that was for tribute, to grow crops to maintain the communities. Now, the black Seminoles are black Indians associated with the Seminole people in Florida. Okay? That's the one common thread in all of them. So when you hear black Indian or black Seminole, for the most part, they're going to be people associated with the Seminoles, whether they're in Florida or they're in Oklahoma. And they are the descendants of free blacks and escaped slaves who fled into Florida. I have some pictures for you so you can see them today. Some of them are a little bit older, but they still, hold powwows, and they're still part of the communities. And you sometimes see them when they do the general cultural events. We've actually had several black Indians that came to the Homestead campus. So here you see a black Seminole Gullah. Now you hear Gullah, you know Gullah, right? South Carolina, the island, the Barrier Islands. Well, the Gullah, they're off the coast of South Carolina. So if slaves are going to escape from South Carolina, they're going to be part of this Gullah community. The Gullah community is a free community, is a free and separate community today. But even when they were part as slaves, they lived in those islands and Barrier Islands, and they were kind of independent. They did the rice fields. The whole region from the Carolinas down to Jacksonville has been declared the Gullah Geechee Corridor. And they're doing a lot of research now and background studies on these people who are escaped Maroons, whose families are intact, who have their own language, their own culture, their own history. And again, they're doing a lot of looking into their history because, like I mentioned already, the history books don't have all this information. This particular family was found in Cypress Tiger, Kendall. Okay? Big Cypress is another community of the Seminoles, and we found them there. And you see they're black. You see her. Okay, you see there she is. The features are definitely black, and you see her in the Seminole. You see the same thing here, okay, and the traditional dress. This is a Cherokee, Afro-Native Cherokee. Again, we see them very often here in the powwows and events. And you can see her with her dress, right? Again, Native American, but also black. And when people see them, they say, Black Indians, what is that? Right? A lot of people don't know about them, and they're shocked. They're, why are you dressed as an Indian? And they say, I'm not dressed as an Indian. I am Cherokee, and I am black. This is a blended family. Yeah, you know what blended family is, Except there's like 2 wives. Here's the chief, right? Definitely Native American. Here's the Native American wife, and you see her? What do you see? African features. And then look at the children. Definitely, probably hers, maybe this one also, but this one may be also mixed. So you had very often these families that were together. And included, again, the Indian, because I mentioned already the importance of being part of the clan, and then the other wife. So you did have, usually the chiefs did it. They would marry the black women from the black Seminoles to establish like a tie. It's like a marriage, a political marriage. This is Diane Fletcher. She was actually a teacher in the Indian schools when they're established. She was an African Seminole. Again, there's her features and coloring, but you see the full dress. And she joined the Kiowa tribe. Here is another Teresita and Apache chief, Costelitos in Texas. He was Apache, but you can see here especially, see? And also here, she's the features, right? I know it's kind of hard, but this is the best pictures. This is the Kiowa chief, Lone Wolf, right? And his wife, Etla, and you can see, again, mixed features there. And this is Seminole Indians from the Everglades in the traditional bride and groom outfit. And you can see he's more African, and she's got more Indian features. But again, they were part of the Seminole community. They were separate, but they were a part of it. Okay. African Americans with Native ancestry. There's so many of them. This is just a partial list. I thought you might be interested to see some of them, right? Crispus Attucks, right, considered the first African American to die in the American Revolution in Boston Massacre. He was a slave, but he worked on the docks and he was killed. He was a Wampanoag Indian. Langston Hughes, a famous black writer, poet from the Harlem Renaissance, right? Red Fox, you guys know Red Fox, right? I chose ones that most of you I figured would know. Red Fox, right? Part Seminole. Now you see where you get those real high cheekbones and where the red name came from, right? The red Indian. Jimi Hendrix, he was part Cherokee. Michael Jackson, Choctaw and Blackfoot. Eartha Kitt, James Earl Jones, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Della Reese, Cherokee, Tina Turner, Oprah Winfrey. And I just found this out myself. DNA testing in 2009 indicates that First Lady Michelle Obama has Native American ancestry, a family in Mississippi. The Seminole Wars. What were the Seminole Wars about? Pretty much the Seminole Wars are going to be that period in history in which the United States fought with the Florida Seminoles and the freed black men. Before Florida is turned over to the United States, when they purchased Florida in 1819, the main concern of the war is to try and recover runaway slaves, or go across and capture slaves, free or runaway. Eventually, when the Indian Removal Act is passed, the Indian Removal Act is passed, which requires the Native Americans to be relocated, the 5 civilized tribes relocated in what you know as the Trail of Tears. Many of the Native Americans had Africans as allies, but also had them as slaves. So the Seminoles did not want to leave Florida, and one of their concerns was leaving Florida because of their slaves. They were afraid that once they crossed into that territory that they could not protect them. And unfortunately, this is exactly what happened. We have several instances where they are captured. As soon as they left Florida in transit to Oklahoma, they start capturing them. The Seminoles themselves are called Seminole. The name comes from Cimarron because they were runaways. The people we call Seminoles are actually made up of different tribes. So the name Seminole appears to have come from the Spanish Cimarron, and eventually the Seminoles themselves adopted it as a people separate from the tribes they belonged to, including the Cree. The interest was to stop the raiding and stop the running away. So you wanted to take that buffer and now claim Florida. It was a territorial acquisition, but it was also to really stop what they saw as a danger to the slave plantation society. Okay, let me go quickly. We don't need to look at the war, but I just did want to look at this here. When Florida was annexed, all right, it really becomes a concern because now it's a U.S. territory. And they definitely fall now under the U.S. slave laws in the South because Florida was a southern state. The Second Seminole War was because the United States is trying to force them to leave. Under the policy of Indian removal, they wanted to relocate Florida's 4,000 Seminoles. Most of the Seminoles, unfortunately, died in the wars. Very few Seminoles actually were able to leave. And most of their 800 black Seminole, more than 500 of them traveled with the Seminoles and died with them on the Trail of Tears. And again, we don't often see that part of history. The tension exists. The attempt is always to capture them. As soon as they start the process of going out, they start taking them. They were supposed to go to Tampa. From Tampa, take a ship to Mexico. Right there in Tampa, before they even get on the ship, they're captured by slave raiders. So the Seminoles and the black Indians, the black Seminoles, they had reason to fear, leaving Florida because they knew what would happen to them. Anticipating attempts to re-enslave them, they were the ones that were opposed to removal. And some individuals claim that the Seminole War was really a slave rebellion, and it was really a Negro war. And that while it was fought with the Indians, the major soldiers and protagonists were the black Seminoles, who were allies of the Indians, and who fought very hard not to be removed from Florida. Some of them will leave, some of them will stay. The ones that leave go to Oklahoma. The ones that stay, they will go into the Everglades, and that's where we see them with those Seminoles that also refuse to leave. The black Seminole warrior, you see him here in dress again. This is Osceola. Osceola is important because he was a major protagonist in the Second Seminole War. There's 2 stories about him. One of the stories is that one of his wives was part African and Yamasee. And in one of the peace treaties, because they would meet in a truce, and the truce wasn't honored, she was captured and his son and sold into slavery. And this sets him off. Now that story, there's, back and forth. Some of the chiefs did not want to go. One of the chiefs did, and this did happen. One of the chiefs agreed to go, went to Tampa, and among the 100 slaves that are captured, his granddaughter, who was Black Seminole, was captured. So there are these individuals of the Seminole Nation that face personal loss, and this is one of the reasons why they were entrenched. They said, we're not going, because they were family members, not just slaves, but family members that were in danger. They go to Mexico. Why Mexico? Because Mexico prohibited slavery. So they go into Oklahoma, not safe in Oklahoma, about 180 of them escape into Mexico. They get asylum, and they became the border patrol between Mexico and the United States. What was their role? To stop invasions by slave raiders, but also to stop Indians, Comanche, Cherokee, all those that were crossing into Mexico and stealing cattle. So they became this militia. They stayed there, and some of them still live there. When we have the established in the end of the Civil War, and freedom is established for Africans, they're all freed, then some of them will go to Texas. So that's where we get the ones that stay in Mexico are still called Mascagos. The ones that go to Texas are the Seminoles that are not Indians. And as you can see, the Seminole Wars were considered to be one of the costliest of the Indian wars, right? 1,500 U.S. soldiers, more than $40,000, and they could not win the battle. And they basically say that a key element of not winning was the Black Seminole fighters, the Black Seminole soldiers. Their descendants today, Oklahoma, Texas, Bahamas, northern Mexico, I already kind of mentioned them. These individuals are free. Many of them later became part of the Seminole Scouts. When, after independence, you have the whole exploration of the West, and these were individuals that knew the West. Many of them would become Indian Seminole Scouts that were employed by the U.S. Army until 1914. It did include both Black Seminoles and Native Seminoles. Some of them will go with the Buffalo Soldiers, but they were not Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers is another story. And some of them became cowboys, which is another story. Basically, that's it. We have time for try to rush through it. So today's presentation, as you can see, was really an attempt to constantly seek freedom and to protect that freedom. And again, these communities all exist today. They're everywhere. We have the town of Adjuntas in Puerto Rico is a Cimarron community. Matanzas in Cuba is a Cimarron community. When the British acquire, after the American Revolution, Spain, in the Treaty of Paris, Spain has to give up Florida. They get the Louisiana Purchase, but they give up Florida. So then the British come in. At that point, the Spanish take all of the Black Maroons that are part of their community and go to Cuba. They leave with them. They never return. That group never returned. They remain separate. Fernando Menendez, the Black commander, he was for a while in, I think they went to Matanzas, and then he went to Havana. But that group, as far as they know, never returned. They're documenting, though, the stories of a lot of them, and some of their stories were documented during the Great Depression when they started doing those projects, WPA projects. So you can actually hear their narratives in the Library of Congress archives. It's kind of hard to understand them, but they have transcripts, if you want to see them, where they interviewed them. And they talk about their lives, who they were, their families, and, of course, their Indian roots. Questions? Questions? Is there anything I left out? Is there anything you didn't remember? Did I go too fast? Yes?